Okay, so thank you for coming out. I'm always one of those people who throws a party and is surprised when anybody shows up. So thank you. Did most of you hear about this through Script Magazine or through the theater or? Yeah, through the theater. Oh, okay. Script Magazine, hands? Tweeting? Tweeting. Okay, because they started the tweeting thing for me. Okay, anyway, it's great. It's a nice number of people. Happy to have you. Okay, so you may or may not have gotten this from the handouts or whatever information you did hear about it, but the context of the next hour is designed to sort of tease you into hopefully taking the workshop, which is amazing. I did it in January at the Writer's Store, and we had a lot of success with it. I tweaked it a little bit to make it 2 days, and I'll explain that format a little bit later on. But I do hope to leave you after the hour with some takeaways regardless. So, all right, so it is only an hour, so I think what I'll do is just give you a little bit of background about myself, a little bit about how the class developed, and then I'll let you guys ask me any questions you want to ask about pitch. I've done a lot of pitching. I've helped a lot of people learn how to pitch or anything about being on a show, whatever you want. It'll be sort of an open forum. So basically this class developed from something I saw in my UCLA class. I teach at UCLA. I'm teaching a class now, writing spec pilots, but I primarily have taught how to write original half-hour pilots. And what I learned on the very first night of my very first class, when I casually went around the room and said, well, why don't you just quickly pitch me your story? Tell me what your story is. When I looked around the room, it looked like Ebola, the Ebola virus had fallen on the entire room in the space of my asking that question. People's faces went ashen and they panicked. And it was tragic. And I tried to lighten the mood very quickly by saying, look, let me just tell you something. I have about $5 in my wallet, and I'm not spending it on any of your pilots, so there's nothing at stake here. Just tell me the story. And not only that, but everybody in the room, there were only about 6 people. They'd been in this program. It's the professional program at UCLA. They had been with each other for almost a year already. They were very close. So there couldn't have been that kind of any tremendous, anyway. What happened was I saw an opening. I saw something that maybe I could bring to the table that maybe some of the other teachers so far that they hadn't been doing yet, which was just simply to get them comfortable telling their story out loud. Because if for no other reason, there's something that happens organically when you tell a story out loud that goes back thousands of years, when that's how we told stories, where you learn if you're doing a good job telling your story. You learn if you're holding your audience. I think you may even improvise in order to get them back. And what they told me, because we started doing this in class week after week, was that they were developing their story much quicker than they were when they just sat in front of the computer trying to figure it out. It was just sort of happening on the fly in the room. And it was really exciting for me, and this was just them pitching their stories. There is a whole template that I developed myself over the years when I go into pitch to networks and to producers that involves about 6 different things you need to get done in that 15 minutes, and only one of them is actually pitching the pilot. So this was just a little piece of it that they were getting their hands on, but I also saw something happen one night with one of the girls in the class who was actually kind of the most terrified about the whole process from the beginning, and I had a guest speaker come who was an executive producer on Parenthood, and she had some big credits, and people had IMDb'd her, and everybody was sort of looking forward to her coming. And so she came into the room, and this girl had been pitching it to me, and she was sort of fumbling and having, her normal experience of angst and anxiety. And this woman sat down, and whatever she brought into the room with her resume or her persona, this girl I said, okay, go. Why don't you pitch it to Sarah right now? And she looked at me like, holy crap, are you serious? And she knew there was no way out. And what happened next was she pitched her pilot, and the thing went through the roof. It was amazing. This girl rose to the occasion for whatever reason under the pressure of this new person coming into the room. And it was a really, for a teacher, it was kind of a gratifying, wonderful experience. So I developed this class that we taught at the writer's store. And anyway, so my experience pitching myself, I could certainly empathize with these students at UCLA, because the very first time I ever pitched, I tell this anecdote because it's so horrible, was a movie. And it's a good story because I was pitching a remake of When a Stranger Calls, which actually somebody wound up doing, and it made a lot of money. So I had a good idea, but I had no idea about what I was doing pitching. I brought in a stack of index cards, and mind you, you probably don't know, or maybe it's on my bio, I forget, I had been a studio executive in the movie business for a while. But I had only been working as a writer for about a year, not even working, wanting to be a writer. So I'd certainly been on the other end of it, which makes it even more tragic. But I wanted to be so prepared that I wrote out every scene of my pitch on a stack of index cards, and I proceeded to go through them one by one. Right? Everybody knows that is the worst idea you can have, but I overcompensated in my own head that by doing that I would do so much work and I would be so thorough. It was a disaster. It was awful. Which is just to say that it's a tragedy when you have a good idea and it gets lost in the pitching process. So I have had a lot of great experiences pitching. I think part of it is, and this is one takeaway that I can give you. One thing you really learn, and you do learn a lot about how to have confidence pitching when you spend time in a writer's room, especially if it's an intimidating writer's room. And I would imagine most of them are on some level if you're a pretty new writer. But the show that I was on for 4 years was a very intimidating writer's room. And I was very, very new to it. I was the only girl in the room, and I was the only one who hadn't been a writer at all. I'd only been a studio executive. So it was very, very terrifying for me to raise my hand and pitch a story idea. But you have to. There are two ways you can fail in a writer's room. One is to be that guy who has an opinion about everything and feels like he just needs to hear the sound of his own voice. And those people tend to disappear very quickly after their contracts are suddenly not renewed. And then there are the people who are too terrified to say anything, and they usually suffer the same fate. So I was probably leaning a little bit more on the quieter side. But I noticed there was a guy in the room who every time he had an idea for a story, and he had a lot of experience, mostly in the movie business, and he probably was somebody who just was born with a fair amount of confidence. But every time he raised his hand to tell a story, he would go into the zone, and it was almost as if he didn't even know anybody else was in the room anymore. But he was telling himself the greatest story in the whole world, and you were just lucky enough to be invited to listen to it. And he would laugh at his own jokes at just sort of the right moment. And it was just this, and so you felt like you were kind of, it sucked you in, it drew you in. And I used that, I psyched myself out the first couple times I went in to pitch. It's a kind of a tricky headspace to get into, but I try to coach people on that as well, to develop that kind of enough excitement about what the story that you're about to tell that you're not there, you're just, it's like a gift you're giving to the people that are lucky enough to be in the room with you. Anyway, that's a little piece of it. So I had that from years of being in this writer's room that I was lucky enough to to have witnessed, and as a survival skill, I thought, well, I'll just steal that, because I've got to have something, because I have ideas, but I need to be able to have the confidence to sort of raise my hand and share them. Okay, so that's definitely a piece of it. The other piece of pitching came from learning from different producers who had different templates and kind of making one my own that worked for me the best. And also using something that I had learned from I taught screenwriting for about 4 or 5 years. And there was something that I learned where I taught screenwriting, which was how to develop we called it a conceit, to how to identify from 5 different areas, what the conceit is of your project. Every project that you have, whether it's a movie or a television idea, you're excited about on some level, obviously. I mean, we have to take that for granted, otherwise we don't have anything to go with. So we identify which of those categories it falls under. It might be, to give you an example, as it's a huge part of it takes about an hour or two to go into this whole idea of conceits. But one idea might be, one of the categories might be you have a story conceit. Story conceits are usually what they call one-sheet movie ideas, big what-if ideas. Or in television, they're usually worlds that we've never been to. It could be a desert island. It could be the world of Game of Thrones. You get the idea. Some kind of a world, some kind of a job that we've never seen before. But there are others. There are 4 other categories. And you identify that conceit before you even begin working on the pitch, because you have to know, your job is to know where the gold is. And really the key to developing any project, and I tell people that took the class before, that this learning how to pitch is not just about learning how to go into a room and sell your project. It's really about learning how to exponentially develop your project. Okay, and my goal always, as an executive, as a teacher, as a writer myself, has been to avoid writing needless drafts. I'm going a little bit off tangent here, but it is sort of something I really care about. I was just telling somebody, a new client I was working with today, that I believe that every project a writer embarks on, and it works as a metaphor for any project you might have in your life. If you're remodeling your kitchen, you have a finite amount of energy that you're willing to spend on this project. And at some point, you're just going to go, you know what, screw it. The cabinets are good enough. I'm tired of having these contractors in my kitchen. I've spent all the money I want to spend. I'm moving on to the bathroom, right? We've all had projects where we get to the end of the road and we're like, and we have to abandon them because we're just done, right? You sort of know that. So my goal, and what I think is so incredibly magical about finding out what the conceit is that that's how you fully develop your project. Everybody in this town talks about, I'm developing this, I'm developing that. And it sort of loses its meaning, right? But what does it mean to develop something? It has an end goal. You're not supposed to develop it eternally, forever. You're supposed to finish developing something. You're supposed to finish the kitchen, before you move on to the bathroom. And so it starts with the conceit, and you have to identify it. Not everybody has a story conceit in their project. You might have something else, but you got to be honest about what that is. You have to have that level of awareness. And again, a lot about developing projects is having an awareness of what you're doing and not just sort of flailing about going, well, I just think it would make a good TV show. Let me just cross my fingers and do the best I can. There's so much more awareness you can bring into it. So it starts with the conceit. And so you develop that. You make the most of it so that you do feel like, because maybe you aren't that person like that guy in my writer's room who was born confident. Maybe you're not. I'm not. I didn't come into this world like an overly confident person, but I can do the work so that I'm confident about. I was confident when I walked into that when a stranger calls pitch meeting because I'd done the homework, but that was all the knowledge that I had. I didn't have any other tools. Now I have so many tools that when I walk into a pitch, they may say no because of a million reasons. And we all know what those reasons could be. They have nothing to do with us. But I developed the project to its maximum potential. And I try to have a producer, or I try to have people in my life that will check me on that, because we always have blind spots. But at this point, I have enough tools that I've learned over the years. And one of them is developing the conceit, which I always just picture as like that little gold nugget. Okay? And you just want to share that with the room in that 15 minutes, which flies by. Okay, it's really not a lot of time. So we start there before we even get into, everybody always wants to know what's the template for pitching. But we start with the conceit. We start with that in the workshop, and everybody gets really excited because they probably didn't even know. They think they have one thing, but then they find, it's like you're playing detective a little bit in the beginning, trying to figure out where that nugget is. Then you can go on to develop it so you can share it and hit these different points in the template during those 15 minutes. So that's a big part of the development process. I spoke at UCLA for 3 hours in a master's class about pitching, and for whatever reason, I mean, every time I speak it's different, but in that class, what I did, because I knew who was showing up, I was able to email them ahead of time, was I asked them to bring in the anecdote. And the anecdote is, if you look on the course outline, I don't know why it's the second dash. It probably, if it's in order, it should be the first, warming the room. This is how, and it sounds easier conceptually than it really is, but you want to give this some thought, and I've worked with people to change their anecdote. I don't know if you read Deadline Hollywood or if you follow stories about pitches that are selling, but oftentimes, it's so ridiculous because I think a lot of times people are lying, but you'll see it says based on a true story, and it's usually, somebody whose father moved in with them, or they had to move in with their uncle. It seems to always be about strange people moving in and living under the same roof together. But there is something comforting, for whatever reason, for executives or the people on the other side of listening to your story to hear that it's a personal story, that you lived it, because it makes them feel confident that when you're in the writer's room, you'll be able to generate lots of stories because nobody even stops to think for a second. You might actually have an imagination that could make stuff up. They find more comfort in the idea that it actually happened to you, so you'll be able to draw on those experiences. So yeah, sometimes I tell people, and I'm realizing I'm being taped now, this will be on the internet forever, but sometimes I tell people to lie. Or fudge it a little bit. If it feels like it is something that could have been a personal story, I don't believe that they're all personal stories either. But I did actually sell one pilot to MTV that was really, really loosely based. It was a springboard for my childhood growing up in Miami, Florida. I wanted to do like a Gossip Girl in Miami. So I think I was pretty honest saying that it was my childhood, but much sexier. But it was very easy to draw the room in. And this was one of my earlier pitches, so I didn't have it kind of down as much as I do now. So in retrospect, it doesn't seem surprising, but I was so passionate about it because it had been a part of my childhood. I grew up in Miami, sort of at that Miami Vice kind of Mariel boat left kind of period in Miami, where it was just on the verge from being where your grandparents went to die to being like the uber cool place of the East Coast. Anyway, I went to this high school that was on Biscayne Bay, and our soccer field literally had a view of the Scarface house on the other side of the bay. So you can sort of picture it. this really, really sweet little private high school that had this incredible piece of real estate that they'd had for like 100 years right on Biscayne Bay. Anyway, every morning for most of my high school years, we would come to school and there would be these giant bales of pot had washed up on our soccer field. Because in the middle of the night, these drug runners would be chased by the Coast Guard and they would just drop it. And I thought that was the most fascinating thing in the world. I thought it was so interesting. Not to mention there were these waves of Latin kids who started showing up at our school whose parents were in the import-export business and things like that. So it was a really interesting time to be growing up there. And it was always in my head. Anyway, I went in there luckily enough because like I said, I didn't have the level of awareness that I do now, but I just went in there with so much excitement to like share this with the room, this story, and use it as a springboard for the show that I wanted to tell. And I knew I had them like 3 minutes, I only give like an anecdote like 3 minutes. And I knew I had them going forward from that point. So I help people develop their anecdote. Now, it doesn't always have to be a personal story. Like I said, if you want to fudge it, that's fine. But it could be, I used the example of Shonda Rhimes and Scandal. Now, taking aside for the moment the very obvious component that Shonda Rhimes walks in and sells, I don't think anything, but pretty much anything. But she brings in with her the woman who actually had the job that Olivia Pope had, but under Bush. She brought her into the meeting. And that helps also. But if you wanted to, right, I know, part of it's ridiculous. But the point is that if you wanted to tell that kind of a story, your anecdote should be about your passion for politics or crisis management or anything, any component about that story, or your intention to find somebody, or you've done some research. I've been emailing with somebody in this office, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there are ways to pad what you have or don't have going in there. But the point is you have to make that connection immediately with whoever you're trying to get to invest in your project. And it may be, look, here's the other thing about learning how to pitch. It's not just for the goal of being in front of somebody who at the end of a half hour can say, yes, we'll call your agent and the check is on the way. It may be a showrunner that lives down the street from you who you want to get excited enough that he can bring his weight with him into a room with you. It may be a producer who's willing to spend 18 afternoons with you over the next 6 months at Coffee Bean on Westwood Boulevard helping you work this, and then he has some meetings that he can get you. You never know. A lot of times there's that interim stage where you get your ally and you get your partner and you're still pitching them because you're trying to get them to sign on board with your dream, with your vision, and it really is just air at this point, We forget that sometimes. We're asking people to get invested in something that doesn't exist. It's not this mic or this chair or this stage or this room, It's just our ideas. And so that anecdote is how you can get people hooked into the beginning of it. And then, then there are about 4 or 5 other components to it, and it's all sort of measured out. I really only give about 3 or 4 minutes to the actual pilot. So that's another thing that we practice, is really learning how to economically tell the story in 3 or 4 minutes. It's not a lot of time. You can't have your index cards, I really ask people to get it committed to memory as best as possible. I always have an iPad with me that somehow is just like a security blanket, and I kind of look down and I know when that page is done and I swipe it with my finger, but I really have it memorized in my head. And so every component doesn't even have more than 3 or 4 minutes, but the truth is television and screenwriting, but particularly television, is a really, really economical language. So learning how to pitch again, is just another level that I think actually helps your writing ultimately, whether or not you wind up being in front of a room of executives who can buy your pitch. I think that it's sort of required. It's a required skill set, because you never know when you're going to have that opportunity. It may be on the fly and you may not go through all of the components of the pitch, but somebody may just want to hear a piece about the main character, or they may want to hear something about the pilot or your future episode ideas or something like that. But those are kind of all of the things that we work on. And the format of the class is, and this is how I developed it from the writer's store, I found I didn't realize I had it, the first time I had the class, it was just for one Saturday. And there was so much I wanted to really, particularly the area of conceits was something that people sort of lit up when they heard about, and I brought a couple of, what I did was I pretended that I was pitching Scandal and The Big Bang Theory, and I walked it through, and I used it as an example, because I find it's also very helpful to study blueprints of other people's shows as I'm creating my own blueprint. Plus, it's a common language. I mean, those are two pretty popular shows, and I do both because you never know if the room is going to have half-hour writers or hour writers. Anyway, we got to talking, we got so into it, we got so into the conceits part of it that we spent about 4 hours doing that, and I really wanted a piece of the class to be, I really wanted it to be an active workshop. I want everybody in the class to actually have the experience of pitching their project. And because it's also a little bit difficult to do it on the fly, we ended that class and we decided to voluntarily extend it to the following weekend. So going forward, I realized this really has to be a 2-day event. So the way I structured it this time, I think, is even better than last time, in that we have a full 4 hours the first Saturday morning to go through conceits and using examples of other shows and the template of pitching, and hopefully get a few people up on stage maybe just talking about their anecdotes, which often changes. You find, I can think of a couple examples where people found that they were able to pull something from their own life that inspired the show, and they thought it was something different. Anyway, it's not always what you think it is. So we maybe get a little bit of that, and then I give you a little more than 2 weeks to go home and work on your pitch. So by the time you come back, you're pitching it, I don't know, I've never done it here before, but it would just be right up, we would try to create an environment that's most like any kind of a situation where you'd be pitching it to more than one person, because that can be where people kind of lose it, because you have to learn. That's another part of it that just comes through practice, is learning how to play to different people in the room. Just make different eye contact throughout the pitch. Anyway, so everybody gets their 15 minutes to do it, and then I give feedback, and then everybody else gives feedback as well. But it gives you like a good full 2 weeks so you can kind of work on it and have time to think about it, because it's a lot to process, and you'll find, hopefully, I mean, I know, honestly, I'm writing a pilot actually from scratch right now. I've never done this before, but I have a partner, and I've never written with a partner before, but it was his idea, and I started helping him so much with it that he asked me if I would write it with him, and it just seemed like a better way to do it than to try to go out and pitch it first. So anyway, we're writing it, and I'm using the pitching template to develop the pilot. It becomes a way, when you just have an idea of something you think you might want to write, but you're not really sure if it's an idea or not, to test it. And again, to develop it. I mean, some ideas aren't ready to be born yet. You don't know enough information about them. So again, with that goal of not spending 6 months in front of a computer writing a draft before you can figure that out, you can spend a couple weeks using a template/worksheet to see if you know enough about it now. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. So that's what we're doing to develop this pilot. So I think that for the moment, I'm going to take a deep breath at the sound of my own voice and throw it out to you guys and see if you have any questions. The one thing I almost wanted to preface this with, except it feels like it's almost becoming obvious, or maybe it isn't, this is a really, really great time to be a television writer or to want to write for television, because there is so much work and there is such an incredibly voracious appetite for content. I was just saying outside to Michael that a friend of mine has a pilot on Amazon, and it's called Transparent. Have you seen it yet? Yeah, it's really good. Anyway, I saw about 4 that they did, and I was really, really impressed. I mean, I think you sort of think at first blush, oh, Amazon. And this woman has amazing credit, so I was also thought when she did it there, I was like, wow, that they're lucky to have her. But I guess kind of conceptually, you're like, well, that's where I buy my dog treats from. But their production values are incredibly high. I mean, Chris Carter has a pilot there. And they were all really good. All of the ones that I saw, I liked hers the most. But in any case, they're sort of the way I understand it, they're letting the audiences pick which ones go from pilot to series. And hers made it. And I think that's sort of interesting. I was discussing this with somebody outside. I have another friend who's shooting this is kind of these couple weeks are when everybody's shooting their pilots. I don't know if you drive around town, you see that everywhere I go, it seems like I see those yellow signs, which are basically crew parking. They're all pilots. And it's just so crazy because I really hope his pilot goes, but to think that at some point it's going to be up to 3 or 4 executives are going to look at all these pilots and decide which ones of them go to series. And then to some degree, the public will decide based on ratings, but not entirely. And then the rest of them will just sort of disappear. So I don't know, maybe Amazon is onto something new. But in any case, I mean, Hulu was doing content, places on your cable dial you never thought were going to do scripted programming are doing it, from DirecTV to ESPN. I mean, it's just amazing. So it's a really, really good time to be it's really, really encouraging. And a lot of spec pilots, people are writing on spec, from unknown writers to established writers, are getting made. So it's not as elite of a industry as maybe it was even 5 years ago, which I think is great, and they're really desperate for original voices. And if your pilot doesn't get made, if you're interested in being a writer's room, those are the samples that they want to read, original pilots. They're not really reading specs anymore. They read short stories, they read plays, but they love to read original pilots because there's just this thing in the air right now to look for original voices and what you can add to a room with yours. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of add that because I think a lot of times, because I've been in front of, I've been doing this for at least 10 years, maybe, back then as a screenwriting coach, but it was always sort of like kind of hard question to answer. Well, how do I break in, or how do I get an agent, or how do I get a manager? And whoever really knows the answer to that question. But these days, I think that there's always a little bit of that, and you have to be an extroverted person or at least someone who's aware of networking opportunities or is out there in the world trying to meet people. But it's still more than ever, I think, there's an opportunity for people who have good material to get read and to have opportunities, make opportunities for themselves. So, all right, I got that in. A little optimism. So, does anybody have any questions? Yes, your name?
Brent.
Brent.
So you answered one of the things I was going to ask you about spec pilot versus original.
Oh,
but
okay.
Given that there are so many premium cable network, Amazon, seems like maybe you might need more than one, spec pilot, because the people that are buying for, you might get your spec in front of a network, but it's not really right for a network, but it might be right for cable, but you can't get it in front of cable. Do you have thoughts about that?
Can you repeat the questions on
Yes, but I'm not sure I understand the question. So I just want to make sure when you say spec,
Let me really
okay.
dial that down
Okay.
and get it a lot more precise.
Okay.
Given that the networks, that all of these different outlets are looking for different type of content, how do you go about pitching, getting, a spec pilot that they're all going to be interested in? Or does it even matter? They're just looking for good writing?
I think I can answer that. Sometimes I have heard when some people go out and pitch their original pilots, they change their pitches for different networks. I have heard that, but if it's written already, I would say, I know you don't mean this, but you're not going to write 12 different versions of it. No, I think it, in some ways, because it's almost impossible to write to a specific potential buyer, it almost frees you up to really write what you want to write. You can write anything. I have seen things on television in the last year or so, stuff that Ryan Murphy was doing with American Horror Story that's only FX, it's not even that deep in cable, just blew me away what you can get away with. There's so much freedom right now. So I say write exactly what you want to write. Write it without act breaks. My friend sold a pilot to NBC that didn't even have act breaks in it. Oh, we'll figure it out when we're editing it. And I'm not, going on record saying that, but I just think there's so much freedom now to do exactly what you want to do and to write, to say exactly what you want to say. That being said, it almost raises the bar that you do have something to say. There's still a lot of mediocre television out there. Don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of great television also. There's still people getting away with mediocrity, but we'll just ignore those people. But I do think it raises the bar. We're going through that right now with my pilot that we're writing. And I'm really challenging my partner to say, what is it we want to say? What is our opinion about this, behind the story? So does that answer your question? Okay, good. Yes, what is your name?
Kevin, hi.
Kevin, hi.
I was wondering if there's like an opportune time throughout the year to pitch your TV idea. As I know there's the pilot season, so when would you say would be the best time to have your pitch ready?
Traditionally, it's early summer. You go into the networks, midsummer, like July, and then you start to hear they're running out of money like in September and October. But it just depends. There was something last year where just nobody was coming in with drama pilots for some reason. So that they had plenty of money for that until the end, but I don't know, who knows. But that's just network. And even Fox is talking about having a year-long development cycle now. So, but that's your sort of baseline. But you can do it any time of the year. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons or strengths and weaknesses of bringing in an idea versus having a script attached to your sort of pitch material?
I think you can make a case for either. Sometimes you hear that networks, and again, hear me when I say networks, which is still the more old school buyers, don't like to buy spec pitches because then they don't get to be as involved in the creation of the show. And it's an ego thing that they like to throw their 2 cents in, or that they like to feel that they've done their job, or they've had a hand in shaping it, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, every year there are specs that are original pilots, that are written by the networks. If I could imagine a scenario where you wrote it maybe for yourself, but then you wound up pitching it and you just sort of didn't need to tell anybody that you wrote it. Or I don't think it can hurt to write it if for no other reason, if you have the energy for it, that you wanted the experience of writing it, but you're open to it changing once you pitch it. If you're going in and pitching it, you may not want to let them know that it's all so specific. If you have a producer that you're close with, you may want to say, yes, I do have the draft already, and he reads it, and maybe he says, okay, well, we don't need to tell them that we have it. We're going to pitch a version of it.
Okay.
Yes, in the back.
In your experience, what have you found harder to pitch, comedies or dramas?
Lisa, can you please rephrase the questions for the
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. In my experience, what is it harder to pitch, comedies or dramas?
And half-hour or hour situations?
Right. I've only sold 2 hours, but I knew that I think there's a little bit more pressure to pitch a half hour because you just feel like you have to be funnier. But they tend to want to know more of the story arc for the hour shows also, where it's going, how you're going to be able to sustain that kind of length of storytelling. So there's a little bit more pressure on you for future episode ideas and season arcs. But other than that, it would depend on the appetite for the buyer that you were in front of. Yes,
what
Greg.
about the question, what else you got? How many pitches do you have prepared when you walk in case they just say, sorry, we pass on that, have you got anything else?
How many do I ever go in with more than one pitch? No. When I meet with, a lot of times my agents will set me up with producers or showrunners just to see if we hit it off and click, and I'll run I call them notions, basically. At any given time, I think a writer should have 6 or 8 ideas that they are sort of percolating in their head. That's a random number, but a bunch of them. But I can't imagine going in to the buyer with more than one pitch, because I'm so spent by the end of that pitch, I just wouldn't have any mojo left. But also, it takes 3 months of almost like a full-time job to develop a really, really good pitch, at least that you feel really good about. So I can't imagine going in there at once. And I also think it sort of dilutes, I don't know, I'm the kind of guy also that just puts all my cards on the table. This is in that final scenario when it's in the room of the executives, potential buyers. This is what I have. Are you into it or not? Because then we're going, we got other places to go. That's how I play it. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So tapping into your studio exec experience as opposed to the writer end of it, and leaning away from the networks, you have a spec pilot that is written, original pilot that's written, the draft is done. What is the value in doing a sizzle reel to show, like Showtime, HBO, Amazon, Netflix, whatever? What's the value of that to be able to show them something visually, along with an original draft?
I think, what is the value of a sizzle reel? Now, this is funny because this is something that I've been hearing more and more about lately, like just literally in the last couple of months. Somebody asked me to come on board their project, and they sent me a sizzle reel to get me hooked, and I was impressed. But I'm a sucker for high production values. I'm kind of cheap I'm a cheap date, So I don't know if I'm an easy target or not. But as far as showing it to networks, I do think it does have value. That being said, I wouldn't do it unless you can really do it well with those high production values, with calling in actors that can do the job. Otherwise, it certainly has not gotten to a place where it's at all expected. And it has, I personally think there's a bigger risk that it could fail than it could succeed. So I would make sure that if you would just need to have the confidence that it was really the kind of thing you would see on television, like tomorrow, that it would be of that level. Whether or not you can call in favors or you have the money, you want to put the money into it. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question kind of similar to that. There are shows like Always Sunny in Philadelphia is kind of one that a lot of people are familiar with how they got picked up from actually shooting a show with just terrible production values. How is that even possible, I guess?
I once heard, how is the Always Sunny in Philadelphia story possible? I don't know. I heard the story on KCRW. I heard them interviewed, and it was very accidental that I heard it, but I'm glad I did because it always pops up as sort of an urban legend. I'm sure if I went back and listened to it, there's some reason in there that either the guy who was able to do something just thought it was. Sometimes you just have the synchronicity of a passionate fan who can do something. The right person got a clip of something, or it just tickled their funny bone. They thought it was the most original thing they ever saw, and they were willing to go to bat for it, and they are a worthy champion. To have a fan who can also be a worthy champion is such an amazing lottery-winning combination. Having not seen whatever they had shot, I'll just have to take your word for it that it was really bad, low production value, but that may have been part of its charm. It is sort of a really way off to the left kind of a sense of humor, especially 5 years ago when it first started, that maybe that actually helped them. Maybe for them to do something really slick would not have served them. They needed to have that really outlaw kind of a vibe and sensibility to them, so maybe it helped them. Hard to know exactly what the answer is to it, but also even harder to mimic, to try to mimic, yeah.
And I guess just a brief follow-up that would be more general would
be,
would it be harmful if you did have good production values to actually have a full episode as opposed to a sizzle reel?
No, I don't think so, but I would probably, are you talking about a half hour? Yeah, probably better suited to a half hour just for attention spans. But yeah, if you're confident about it, and maybe it doesn't have to be high production value, I think that would probably work better for a half hour, but maybe that's part of your vibe. You're just a couple of guys on stage, acting, scene. I don't know. Anything is possible, but I guess my advice would be, before you try to get it in front of somebody that means something, run it by people where if it's a disaster, they're either your friends or it's not going to cost you anything. It's like submitting a script before it's ready. You only get one read with that friend of a friend who runs somebody's production company or something. So don't blow it before you really, really have tested it on whoever you have in your life that doesn't cost you anything, if that makes sense. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Without an agent that can get you into the room, what's the best way? You mentioned earlier about networking. What's the best way to meet people that can get you into the rooms?
I always suggest what are some good ways to network if you don't have representation? I think that the Writers Guild has lots of really great panels. We live in Los Angeles. It's so impossible to give this advice to people who live in Minnesota or even New York, quite frankly, even much harder. But go to events and ask questions and go up to people afterwards and introduce yourselves and see if you can't figure out, if you go to a Paley event for Parks and Recreation, you're probably not going to get Amy Poehler's email, but see if you can't afterwards sort of hang out and just kind of pay attention to who is somebody's assistant or who's the junior writer. And, my advice about engaging people and meeting people in general is the same advice I have about dating, which is people love to listen to themselves and they love to talk about themselves. So ask them questions. Be friendly, be personable. Everybody's got their guard up that you're going to want something from them. And I think mostly it's their fear that they won't be able to do. That's my fear anyways, always that I'm not going to be able to do anything for you, so I'm going to feel bad. But if you just engage in a conversation with somebody and you take it slowly and you ask them about what they do, you never know where it could lead. You might get to a point where you're able to ask the most bite-sized favor, which I think is always something like, can I send you a log line of my idea? Something as small as possible where you're asking them to do something that they can do. Not get you an agent, not get you a job. Can they read 2 lines of your idea? And start there. And maybe it does lead to an email address, or do you have a Twitter account or something like that? There's so many ways to do this. But you have to think, I was telling my class the other day, you have to think about it like you're the president of your corporation. Okay, you're the CEO. So you get up every day and what are you doing to make your corporation successful? You know, are there 3 active things you can do every day for your corporation? Just go to the website and look what the Writers Guild is offering, what kind of panels. They also have workshops. Do a little research on the contests that are available. Maybe you could make yourself a judge or volunteer at one of these contests. And that way you get to know some of the people who are running the contest. It's a little trickier these days to be interns unless you're actually in college anymore. And quite frankly, if you're a grown-up, you probably don't have time to do that. But you can volunteer at events. You could volunteer at the Paley Center for those amazing television retrospectives that they do. And there's something about if you were actually working the event, that you would have much more of an organic opportunity to have a conversation with Amy Poehler than you would, just the guy who bought a ticket. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. Any kind of an opportunity where you're both in a work environment creates a feeling of comfort with the other person, because then they know that you have a job to do there as well and you're just doing your job, and then they get to know you a little bit. And then, that creates some sort of an opportunity for something to go beyond that evening, right? And then if you have your pitching skills ready to go, you may have the opportunity right, then and there, or at another moment where you can just say, I had this really funny idea for this kind of a show. And then if they're open to it, you can decide which little piece of it you want to give to them, if they're up for a little bit more. But there are so many opportunities in this city to get in front of people that it's just almost incumbent upon you to do that, because yes, not everybody does have agents, and even our agents don't always work for us. I create a lot of my opportunities for myself, and I think most writers will tell you that. And it's fun. There's a lot of stuff that's going on here. Any other questions? Yes.
Riffing off a thing that I think you wrote in here, saying like more people would want to hear your story than read your story.
Yes.
Do you have any hard and fast rules about sending pitch material, like before a pitch meeting, sending materials before said meeting so they have the opportunity to sort of get on the same page, or do you always only follow up?
No, in fact, there seems to be some sort, sorry, I'm very bad at this. Do I ever send materials ahead of when I'm pitching? No, because first of all, it's my experience that everybody's doing everything they can to avoid reading in this town. That is everybody's goal, to read as little as possible. They will only read when under great duress. So it's not going to get read anyway. And I forget how it was explained to me by a manager one time, but they said never leave anything behind. It just gives them something to pick over and have an excuse to say no. So yeah, avoid that. People talk about writing show Bibles and things like that. And one of the things we talk in the workshop is about how far you have to go in your pitch, about knowing how far you see the show and ideas like that. But there's really no reason to leave any kind of paperwork behind or send it ahead. Yeah.
Let me
Yes,
just ask
great.
one.
Yes.
Now you sell a lot of pitches, but somebody coming in might not necessarily have a goal of creating a series that's on the air, but maybe just getting onto staff. Is your approach different when your goal is to get on staff versus your goal is to create your own series?
Is your approach different to getting on series or selling a pilot? No, because your goal is to write the best half-hour show or the best hour show that you can. And again, the way that I teach pitching, it could also be called a development, an intense development workshop, under the guise of being able to use that development in a pitching situation. But no, it's to develop to tell the best story that you possibly can, and to find out what that story is. But no, it's not any different. Yes,
So for
in the
your
back,
course-
Michael.
For your course, should people come in with an idea, with a script, with something that they want to turn into?
That's a good question. You can have anything. You can have a draft of something that's got cobwebs on it from a year ago, and you always knew that there was potential in that idea, but you sort of lost sight of that. Or you can come in with a notion. You know, I always wanted to do I've never gotten beyond this notion of somebody who works in a bank. And did you know more money is stolen from bank employees than bank robberies? So I'm throwing this idea out there, but I always wanted to come up with a story about like kind of a Robin Hood character who works in a bank and it's very easy, as I've done, not myself, but I've done research to make tiny little adjustments on people's deposit slips and steal money from a bank if you work at a bank. But they were doing it for the good of for their community, like a Robin Hood kind of a thing. And I've never gotten beyond that. I've never decided to have pitched it. It's one of those things I carry with me as a notion to meetings with producers every 6 months or so. You could come in with that, and we can run it through the template and see how far we get. Start with an anecdote, see if there's an anecdote that's even, and I don't know what my anecdote would be from there, some sort of secret desire to steal money. But yeah, you can come in with any level of it. Some doesn't matter. Good question. Any other questions? No? Yes.
One of the things you said earlier was about the blueprint specifically
Yes.
of particular shows.
Yes.
Can you just expand on what that term means, blueprint?
How it works, where they put the doors and the windows and the bathroom and how big the master bedroom is. And it's just, I really believe in, it's obvious because I'm teaching a class now where people are writing spec shows of existing shows. It seems obvious to me that you should be an expert of that show, right? So I tell them that they should know that blueprint as well as anybody who works on that show, as well as anybody who created that show. Because that's how you, even though that spec may not get them a job, it teaches them how to be in writers' rooms. Because when I went to work on Entourage, I had to be an expert on that show. And so it has to be a show that you care enough about. That was a perfect fit for me, ideal environment for me, because it was just everything about, I had been working in the movie business. I knew those characters. I had tons of story ideas. It was a perfect example for me to be an expert on that show. But I find it very helpful when I'm creating new shows to study other people's shows. For no other reason, particularly in comedy, I try to tell people there's such a big dial these days of comedy, so many types of comedy. I mean, when you think about 20 years ago or whatever, there was just the sitcom, right? 3 jokes on a page, 4 acts, 23 minutes, whatever it is. Now there's it's like this really long radio dial. So I find it very, very helpful in the beginning to just pick a show. Is your show on the dial closest to Girls? Or is it more like House of Lies? Or is it more like Mom or 2.5 Men? And just tune into that dial a little bit. And one way to tune into it, and I'm talking now about writing original shows, is to study the blueprint of it. On 2.5 Men, how many jokes do they have on a page? Do they have a teaser and a tag? Do they just have 4 acts? Do they have A, B, and C stories? Do they have runners? Is it serialized? There's a million questions, but it's comforting there's a logical sense to it, but I also just find it sort of comforting to have other examples, other blueprints in my head. Well, they did it that way, and it's not to say that I'm mimicking them. That's not the goal at all, or anybody's goal, but it's just, again, to go back to the blueprint, I would imagine if you went to school to be an architect, you would study a lot of blueprints before you tried to design your own building. I don't see it any different. I want to know, I'm always the type of kid that like liked to see how things were made, right? Broke them, tried to put them back together. I want to know how things work. That's how my mind works. Maybe that's not, for every writer, but, what are we doing? We're just all sharing our processes here, and this is mine, is to study. I find a lot of comfort in knowing how other people built their shows, especially pilots. I love watching pilots. I really do. It's one of my favorite things, especially half hours. I just find it amazing to me. It's such a, for years I thought I was only going to be a movie writer. I was going to be in the movie business, and that's closed-end storytelling. I'm here to say that I think television writing is so much harder, so much more satisfying, so much more exciting as a narrative form. But especially the pilot, when you think of what you have to accomplish in a pilot, and especially your choice at the end. I love to look at how people end their pilots. What are they saying? How are they packing their suitcase at the end of this little trip to say, hey, come on this journey with me. It's going to be a fucking wild ride, And most of my favorite shows are cable. Not always. There are half-hour shows on network that make me laugh out loud, but I was watching Veep last night with somebody. I was like, oh my God, it's amazing, this show. The actors are fantastic, but the dialogue and the characters and the writing is just, it's perfect. But I love to watch pilots. I love to see how other people who are doing what I'm working on doing, and I don't have my own show on the air yet, but I will. That's my vision, and that's, what I'm working on. So I like to look at people who did it. These people got their shows on the air. What did they do, especially at the end of their show, that made it exciting that you would want to watch another episode of it? And I think of two of my favorites are Californication, where we know he's been this guy with this crazy sex life, and his dilemma is that he's trying to also be a good father and get his wife back. But what do they do at the end? He sleeps with this woman, this young woman, who we not only find out is underage, but she's the future stepdaughter of the estranged wife he's trying to win back. That's the end of that pilot. That's crazy, but I think it's amazing. And then another one I always think about is Nurse Jackie. This whole crazy story, it's a great example of the architecture of that is you could call it icing on the cake. You have this great cake about this story about this nurse with a pill problem, and at the end of it you find out, because you've seen her having sex with the head of the drug dispensary, is that she's married. And that's the end of that pilot. That was icing on the cake. That's, you didn't have to have that in there. It was a great pilot anyway, but that's how they loaded that pilot going forward for the series. And then you have, then there's a completely, not necessarily a completely different type of ending when just pops into my head as girls. Very, very quiet. So it doesn't always have to be that kind of shock value of the examples that I just gave. But Girls just ends on this kind of quiet note. She's just been told by her parents, you're on your own. That's it. We've cut you off. And she walks out into the sea of human bodies that is Manhattan, and she's on her own. That's a really, really quiet moment. I'm always also very impressed when people do things very quietly. I tend to think in terms of big moments. Entourage had more of an ending to their pilot that was kind of a big moment, which was really set the tone for the whole show, which was the two of Eric and Vince looking at each other like, holy crap, we are so in over our heads, like we're fucked. And that was really the theme for 3 or 4 seasons of that show, was these kids who were in over their head. Anyway, so those tend to be kind of, as a writer, stories that I am more likely to tell, but I'm very impressed when people like Lena Dunham write really kind of quiet endings to their pilots that also set the tones for their shows. That's a very quiet show in a lot of ways. I know the nudity and all that makes you think otherwise, but the pacing of it and the storytelling of it is on a much different keel. This show Transparent I'm talking about on Amazon, beautiful storytelling. I couldn't wait to tell this girl that how much I enjoyed the pilot, because it was just a story about, and you guys know what this pilot's about? It's about a man who's going through a sex change operation and is trying to figure out how to tell his family. And it's just this like normal, nice Jewish family feels like it's from somewhere in Silver Lake. But anyway, that's the context of it. But the storytelling is just very, very quiet. And that's also an elegant architecture to me, when people can just kind of quietly let people be who they're going to be, and it moves forward at an entirely different pace, and it feels very satisfying at the end. So I love to collect those examples. And those are just from half hours. Hours go from, I'm impressed with shows like pilots, like Hostages or The Blacklist, that manage to tell so much story at such an incredible pace. They make these action movies in the theaters look slow now. So, those are, and they're also completely different animals. They have more of a movie telling narrative form to them. But I don't know, I just find, I collect them. They're like little Limoges, and I put them in my what do you call them? I line them up and look at them and move them around, and I find them to be enormously helpful when I'm either trying to figure out something myself or trying to help somebody else figure them out. So hopefully you guys are doing the same, because there's a lot of really good stuff out there. Anything else? Yes?
What would you say is your absolute favorite show that you've pitched, and what was it that made it special, whether it be how great the show was or something in the way that you pitched it that just felt right? It
was the show that took place in Miami. They were like, yeah. It was, there's a place in Miami called Fisher Island that is sometimes the wealthiest community in the country. And it was an island that was built by the Vanderbilts in the 1920s, and you can only get there by ferry or by helicopter. And what makes a community technically the richest community in America, it can also be Marina del Rey on any given year, is usually because some athletes have bought pieces of property there, and Oprah. Oprah has a condominium on Fisher Island, but Marina del Rey is where a lot of basketball players and football players live, so they can get to the airport quickly. And I think that they have basketball players have places where they practice. That's forget what it is. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but that's how it usually happens. Anyway, so I thought that Fisher Island could be like like the Upper East Side of Manhattan, but an island. And I don't know, it was just something that was like so deep. I had been like percolating for so long, and it was around the peak of Gossip Girl, and I just thought, who doesn't want to do a show about rich teenagers who, like in my high school, the rich kids didn't have cars, they had cigarette boats, and we had a parking lot for the cigarette boats to drive to school. I mean, this was, this is insane. This is like fun. It was just so full of great stuff, and there was a teenage drug runner and in the show, and it was about, and also when I was in high school, my mom was engaged to a Latin guy, and so for one summer, we had this weird Brady Bunch family. That was really the heart of the show, actually. It wasn't the drugs, now that I think about it. It was, to me, what was so interesting about Miami was that it was that it is this melting pot of cultures. You must speak Spanish if you live in Miami, and you must know the difference between Cuban and Colombian and Brazil. And they're all very, very, they speak at different paces, and in any case. But so it was this idea of like a Latin family and an American family coming together, and how volatile and interesting that would be. And I don't know, I could go on and on about it, but it was just because there were so many layers to it. I just loved it. I still love it. And I wanted to move there and have them shoot it there. And yes, that was definitely my favorite. Because it meant something to me, but I could see I could see the other thing I help people develop are their set pieces, their trailer moments. One really good beginning place to start developing your ideas to think about what the trailer would be. Because a trailer is really just a string of your best moments, right? You ever go to the movies and you feel like, oh my God, why should I even pay? Clearly that's everything that there is. If you go to see the Anchorman trailer, it's like 20 minutes long, and I went to see the movie, there's nothing else in the movie but that. But because they jam everything, the marketing people jam all the good stuff into the trailer. So it's a good way for you to start thinking, what are those great moments? And so in this pitch that I had, this high school show, I had so many great set pieces. And set pieces aren't just visual moments. In half-hour shows, they're lines of dialogue, right? Character moments, windows, actions that reveal character. So that's another kind of way to play detective, to find out what your conceits are, is to think about what your set pieces are. And I like to think of developing a project like a big circle, some kind of a building, a castle or something that's a big circle, so that when one door is locked, you have another door that you can go into. So if you don't know what your conceit is, and you don't now because we haven't talked about it, but if you get stuck there, then you can go back to your trailers and you can go, okay, what kind of set pieces do I have? Well, they tend to be all big action set pieces. There aren't any great lines of dialogue. That would give you a clue. And then you would be able to go in and open the conceit door, because now you know what the conceit is. I hope this is making sense, given we haven't sort of really talked about that yet. But yeah, set pieces are fun. Good things to brainstorm. Kind of gets you excited, because sometimes, 6 months down the road, you don't know why you started some project in the first place. You can always go back to the conceits and the set pieces, because that's what got you excited. And you have to remember that, because you can get lost in the weeds. We all have that moment where, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you do this work, where you're going to get lost. You got to be able to find your way back. And that's what I think the conceits are, those little golden breadcrumbs that lead you back to give you, renewed energy and confidence to, take it over the finish line. Yeah. Anything else? No? Okay. Thank you for coming. If you're interested in signing up for the workshop, please go to Lisa Alden, that's LISAALDEN, me.tumblr.com. LisaAldenme.tumblr.com. The workshop is this Saturday, And there's a discount if you sign up tomorrow, April 15th by noon. Thank you.